Who told you that choosing yourself was selfish? They applauded your sacrifices. They praised your silence. But the moment you put up a boundary, suddenly you became too cold, too distant, too selfish. But here's what they won't admit. They didn't miss you. They missed the version of you they could use. And you weren't selfish. You were just finally done being invisible in your own life. You were tired of bleeding to keep others warm, tired of being the one who always bends first. And in the next few minutes, you'll see what happens when a man stops explaining and starts evolving in silence. Not with noise, not with anger, but with presence so sharp, the world has no choice but to notice. Because this isn't just another motivational video, it's a confrontation, a mirror, for the man who gave too much for too long to people who never looked back. And if you've ever felt that weight of being needed but never truly valued, then this message was made for you. So, before we dive in, I want to ask you something. When was the exact moment you realized that giving everything was costing you yourself? Drop it in the comments below. Not for attention, but because your truth might be the wake-up call another man needs right now. Because when you finally focus on yourself, not to escape, but to rebuild, everything starts to shift. And what used to break you now begins to build you. This is where it starts. The quiet transformation, the return to power. Let's begin. The moment you stopped explaining. You sat in your car for 23 minutes before you even touched the keys. The parking lot was half empty, the last few lights flickering across the concrete like ghosts. Another late meeting. Another day of nodding along. Another quiet walk back to your car with too many thoughts and not enough clarity. You weren't stuck in traffic. You were stuck in your own head. Not angry, not sad, just hollow. It wasn't one big moment that broke you. It never is. It's the accumulation, the quiet dismissals, the glances that say, "You're not needed here." The way your suggestions are brushed aside until someone louder says the same thing. The small cuts, and you've been bleeding silently for months. That night, you didn't cry. You didn't clench the steering wheel or scream at the dashboard. You just sat there, still, listening to your own breath, watching the city fade around you. And in that stillness, something shifted. You started replaying the moments in your head. The boardroom where they talked over you. The hallway where no one looked you in the eye. The so-called friends who reached out only when they needed something. The relationship that made you feel more alone than solitude ever could. And through it all, one truth hit you harder than anything else. You were losing yourself trying to stay visible to people who never truly saw you. You weren't respected. You were tolerated. You weren't included. You were convenient. And somewhere along the line, you began shrinking. Not because you lacked value, but because you were tired of defending it to people who couldn't recognize it, even when it was right in front of them. That realization didn't feel like rage. It felt like release. You didn't need revenge. You needed rebirth. So you stopped trying to explain yourself. You stopped chasing conversations that only led to misunderstandings. You stopped over-delivering to prove you were worthy of a seat at the table. You understood, finally, that some rooms aren't worth sitting in. Some people don't deserve the sound of your voice. And silence isn't weakness. It's the first step toward reclaiming your power. You started choosing your words. Then fewer words. Then no words at all. And the less you said, the more they noticed. Not with admiration, at first, but with confusion, as if your silence disrupted the ecosystem they'd built on your compliance. But you weren't angry. You were focused. You were building something new within yourself. A foundation that didn't rely on their validation, a presence that didn't ask for permission to exist. Epictetus once said, "It is not death or pain that is to be feared, but the fear of death or pain." And you stopped fearing the discomfort of being misunderstood. You stopped fearing what might happen if you walked away. You embraced it. And in doing so, you began to rise, not with noise, not with explanations, but with silence sharpened by truth. They thought they humbled you. What they did was awaken you. That night in the car was the beginning of something they'll never understand. Because when a man chooses silence, not because he's lost, but because he's done explaining, that's the day he becomes dangerous. And you, my friend, became the most dangerous kind of man, the one they never saw coming. When you quietly pulled the plug, you didn't make a big announcement, no grand exit, no final speech. You simply stopped showing up, stopped replying, stopped pouring energy into people who only noticed you when you were useful. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like oxygen. For the first time in years, you could breathe without bending. They didn't notice it at first. That's the thing about quiet exits. People don't feel the loss until the silence echoes louder than your presence ever did. You used to reply in minutes. Now, you let hours pass. You used to offer help without being asked. Now you let them figure it out. You used to give your time like it was endless. Now you protect it like it's sacred. Because it is. There was no fight, no argument, just distance, just space. The kind of space that makes people realize they were never entitled to your access in the first place. You didn't burn bridges. You just stopped building them for people who never once met you halfway. And as you stepped back, the clarity came rushing in. You started to see who only called when they needed something, who only clapped when you failed quietly, but never when you rose loudly, who drained your strength under the disguise of friendship or romance. And you were done bleeding for people who were never willing to heal with you. You weren't cutting them off. You were cutting yourself free. The withdrawal wasn't an act of bitterness. It was an act of discipline. Musonius Rufus once said, "We should discipline ourselves in small things, and from there progress to greater." And you, in the smallest of ways, ignoring that message, skipping that event, choosing silence over small talk, began to master something most men never do: selective access, emotional fasting, strategic invisibility. You weren't ghosting anyone. You were recentering yourself, reclaiming your energy, because not everyone deserves front row seats to your evolution. You started understanding the difference between being needed and being valued, between being available and being respected. And the more you withdrew, the clearer it became. The more they took you for granted because you made yourself too easy to reach, too predictable, too accommodating, but no more. Now, they have to wonder why you stopped texting back, why your voice isn't in the group chat anymore, why your presence feels missing, even when you're in the room. That's the beauty of cutting access quietly. It leaves just enough mystery for them to question everything they thought they knew about you, and it leaves you with something far more valuable than their approval: peace. You didn't need to argue to leave. You just left. You didn't need them to notice to feel powerful. The power was in choosing yourself, finally, fully, quietly. So if they ever ask what happened, tell them nothing happened. You just grew tired of offering explanations to people who already made up their minds. You just got tired of leaking energy into holes that never wanted to be filled. You just remembered who the hell you are. And the man who remembers who he is, he doesn't need to slam the door. He simply closes it. Have you ever pulled away quietly and watched? Who didn't notice? Tell me. What did that moment teach you about who truly valued you? How you rebuilt without witnesses? You disappeared from the noise, but not because you were lost. You walked away to rebuild, not to prove anything to them, but to prove everything to yourself. Because the truth is, they didn't break you. You were already cracked. By years of performing humility, overextending kindness, and swallowing your voice in rooms that never truly welcomed it. So you did the one thing they never expected. You went quiet and went inward. This wasn't retreat. It was refinement. While they scrolled, you studied. While they talked, you listened. While they gathered for attention, you trained in isolation. You started waking up early, not to show off, but to sharpen, lifting not just weights, but your own discipline, reading not to sound smart, but to think clearer. You began mastering routines, so unsexy, so invisible, that no one clapped for them, no one saw, and that's exactly how you wanted it. Because the man you're becoming doesn't need applause. He needs edge, grit, control. You stopped chasing motivation and started building systems. You stopped reacting to pressure and started designing your own resistance. The work wasn't loud. It was lonely, but it was yours. And in that silence, you began to hear something deeper than praise. You heard respect from the only voice that mattered, your own. It wasn't just physical. Sure, you trained your body, but more than that, you trained your mind. You no longer needed chaos to feel alive. You no longer needed recognition to feel worthy. You weren't escaping the world. You were earning your place in it, on your terms. Every rep, every early morning, every night, without validation, every disciplined decision that no one would ever see was a quiet vote cast for the man you were becoming. There's a different kind of hunger that lives in a man who's rebuilding in silence. It's not disparate. It's not performative. It's not about vengeance. It's about readiness. About finally being aligned with the person you said you'd become. You looked in the mirror, not for affirmation, but for honesty. And the man staring back? He was no longer asking for permission. He was preparing for war. Not with the world, but with the weaker version of himself that once accepted crumbs. You stopped begging for a seat at the table. You started building your own. You realized the people who once ignored you, they were a gift. Their absence gave you room to evolve without distraction. The nights you spent alone weren't lonely. They were sacred. Because in solitude, you didn't just find yourself, you built yourself. Marcus Aurelius once said, "Apply yourself to what lies in front of you, like a man whom the task has summoned." And every morning, that's exactly what you did. You showed up, not for optics, not for praise, but because the task summoned you. The work needed doing, the fire needed tending, the foundation needed strengthening. Most men won't understand this phase. They need validation too often. They crave feedback too early. But not you. You became dangerous in your invisibility, powerful in your obscurity. You stopped waiting to be discovered. You chose to become undeniable. And the most powerful version of a man isn't the one who's loudest in the spotlight. It's the one who trains when no one's watching. Because when you build in the shadows, you don't rise for attention. You rise for war. And when you return, they won't recognize your silence as weakness anymore. They'll recognize it as preparation. Why clarity requires cutting ties. You thought the hardest part would be walking away. It wasn't. The real weight came after. When you realized how many people were attached to your old identity, The version of you who over-explained, over-offered, overstayed. The version of you they depended on to carry their chaos, cushion their fall, and never ask for anything in return. But that man no longer exists. And now, you face the quiet violence of subtraction. This isn't ghosting. This isn't bitterness. This is clarity. Ruthless clarity. The kind that doesn't argue, doesn't warn, doesn't ask for permission. It simply removes. Because when you rebuild yourself in silence, you start to see the excess. You see who drains you just by being near, who distorts your focus with subtle guilt, who feels entitled to your time, your energy, your presence, but never once offered respect in return. So, you begin cutting, not to punish, but to protect. You remove the group chat that never really saw you. You unfollow the ghosts of past versions you've outgrown. You stop responding to people who only check in when they're bored, lonely, or in need of validation. You don't announce it. You don't explain it. You just subtract. Because peace isn't something you find, it's something you protect. And sometimes, the only way to protect it is with a sword. Seneca wrote, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you." And now, you finally understand, growth doesn't just require addition. It demands elimination. What you're building can't coexist with what you've outgrown. So you stop managing their feelings. You stop editing yourself to stay digestible. You stop being available out of obligation. And for the first time, your energy feels clean. You're not angry. You're focused. You're not lonely. You're selective. You're not broken. You're just no longer willing to hand access to people who only ever saw your strength as convenience. They'll notice. Maybe not right away, but they'll feel it. The sudden quiet. The absence of your steady support. The fact that you're no longer orbiting their world. Some will lash out. Some will guilt trip. Some will play the victim in a story where they were never the hero to begin with. Let them. You're not severing connections to be cruel. You're severing them to survive. To preserve what you fought for in silence. To make space for alignment, not just attachment. Because not everyone deserves to come with you. This is the cost of peace. Not comfort, but conflict. Not applause, but isolation. Not more, but less. Sharper, cleaner, real. And you've made peace with the fact that your silence will be misunderstood, because the ones who were never listening were never meant to understand you anyway. When you came back without noise, you came back, but not as they remembered you. There was no announcement, no dramatic reveal, just presence, still, calm, composed. You didn't walk in to be seen. You moved like someone who no longer needed permission to take up space, and they felt it, even if they couldn't explain it, even if they pretended not to notice. You didn't come back louder. You came back lighter, clearer, sharper. You were no longer the man who tried to fit in. You were the man who had nothing to prove. Your steps were slower, not because you were hesitant, but because they were deliberate. Every action had weight. Every word had intention. You didn't rush to fill silence anymore. You let it work for you. You didn't over-explain. You didn't seek to correct their misconceptions. You let them believe whatever version of you made them comfortable, while you moved like someone who finally understood. Real power doesn't argue, it just acts. And it's not that you were different just to be different. You were different because you had done the work. You had bled in rooms no one saw, rebuilt yourself in nights no one asked about. You had learned to sit with discomfort without needing to escape, to carry solitude without bitterness, to lead yourself without applause. That kind of change doesn't show up in your clothes or your job title. It shows up in your posture, in your restraint, in the way you walk into a room and no longer shrink. They expected you to come back hungry for validation. You came back full, and that confused them, because the systems they built, those social rules and silent hierarchies, they don't know what to do with a man who no longer plays for approval, who no longer needs access, who no longer overextends himself just to stay liked. You speak less now, but when you do, it lands. You don't chase energy anymore. You protect yours. You don't argue with people committed to misunderstanding you. You just exit the conversation and let time reveal the truth. Epictetus once said, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." You've stopped resisting what is. You've stopped needing life to bend to your ego. You've accepted the terrain and mastered how to move through it without losing your center. You didn't return to impress. You returned to lead. Yourself first, and only those who choose to walk with integrity. You didn't return to be louder. You returned so silently that the room adjusted to you. This isn't arrogance. It's alignment. This isn't detachment. It's direction. You move different now, because you are different. And that quiet shift, that's what makes you unstoppable. If you've ever come back stronger, but quiete, what changed most about how people treated you? Share your transformation in the comments. When they tried and failed to shake you, you knew it was coming. The moment always does. The test, the storm, the knock at your door, disguised as old energy, familiar faces, or subtle provocations. The world doesn't congratulate your peace. It challenges it. It sends people from your past pretending they've changed. It throws chaos dressed as opportunity. It whispers doubt in quiet moments just to see if you still flinch. But you don't. Not anymore. The first time they disrespected you, you explained yourself. The second time, you justified your presence. The third time, you tried to fix what was never yours to carry. But this time, you stay still, not because you're passive, because you're precise. Because silence, now, is not a retreat. It's your sharpest weapon. They think your return means you're soft again, that the man they used to manipulate is still somewhere under that calm exterior, so they test the edges, poke the old wounds, try to bait a reaction. But you've trained for this. In every early morning you chose structure over chaos. In every evening you sat with the ache instead of escaping into distraction. In every moment you withheld your response and built resilience instead. You've outgrown the need to clap back. You no longer defend your name in rooms that disrespect it. You no longer perform calmness. You are calm because your peace isn't situational anymore. It's internal. It's armored. And now, when the storm returns, when the people who once underestimated you come back dressed in false praise or subtle criticism, you don't explain your growth. You let your presence make them uncomfortable. You don't match their tone. You control the room with your stillness. They say things to provoke you. You respond with silence that burns deeper than any insult. They question your choices. You don't justify them. You let the results speak. They try to pull you back into old cycles, and you simply don't step in. Because where they operate on reaction, you operate on reason. Where they seek control, you live by clarity. They want noise. You offer none. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy, And you've taken that to heart? Because the real flex isn't confrontation, it's evolution. It's when they try to rattle you and you don't even blink. It's when they raise their voice and yours gets quieter, not to submit, but to signal you're not in that game anymore. They'll call you distant, cold, changed, and they'll be right. You are changed, not because of what they did, but because of what you built after. You're not here to revisit the fire. You're here because you became the fire. Controlled, contained, but unshakable. So let them try. Let them test. You no longer need to prove anything. Because the man who trained in shadows, who rebuilt without applause, who mastered silence like a sword, he doesn't react to storms. He becomes the storm they can't predict. The day silence became your weapon. There's a moment you don't notice right away, because it's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just happens. One morning, you wake up and realize you're no longer angry, no longer hungry for validation, no longer checking your phone for people who stop checking on you. Something inside you has changed, not violently, but completely. You've become the man who no longer needs to speak to be understood, not because you're mysterious, not because you're trying to be hard to read, but because your presence now speaks what words never could. You walk into rooms and people sit up straighter, not out of fear, but out of instinct. They feel it before they process it. The calm, the control, the gravity. It's not performance. It's embodiment. You don't interrupt. You don't over-explain. You don't need to. The silence that used to feel empty now feels full. Full of knowing. Full of restraint. Full of the kind of power that doesn't shout. It radiates. You're not passive. You're precise. You don't avoid conflict. You simply no longer seek it. You're not here to convince anyone. You're here to move like a man who has nothing to hide and nothing to chase. The world used to pull your emotions like strings. Now it doesn't even get a reaction, not because you're numb, but because you've risen above the need to be triggered. Your strength now is measured in presence, not performance. Measured in how you don't respond, in how you don't need to explain the man you've become. You didn't get here by accident. You earned this stillness, bled for it in quiet seasons. No one clapped for. You were dismissed, underestimated, forgotten. And in that isolation, you found a rhythm, built a core, forged a mind that doesn't sway with opinions, a will that doesn't wobble under pressure. And now, you don't have to prove power. You carry it. Some people will say, you changed. Others won't be able to recognize you at all. They'll say, you're so quiet now, and you'll smile. Not because they're wrong, but because they don't understand that silence was the upgrade. That stillness is your new signal. That every second you don't respond is a reminder you've evolved beyond explanation. Seneca once said, the greatest remedy for anger is delay, and you've taken that further. You've replaced delay with discernment. You don't just wait. You watch. You choose. You move only when it matters. Not reactively, but intentionally. And that, more than any speech or outburst, is what commands attention now. The mastery isn't in becoming louder, it's in becoming clearer. It's when you walk into the same room where they once ignored you, and no one dares interrupt your silence. It's when you meet disrespect with calm, doubt with distance, pressure with poise. It's when your eyes say what your mouth doesn't need to. That's the end game. Not applause, not revenge, but dominance through peace. The kind of peace that doesn't need to be defended. The kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are, and who you no longer need to be. Because once you've mastered yourself, there's nothing left to prove. And the world will feel it. They'll whisper, they'll guess, they'll speculate, but they won't shake you. Because when you become a man of few words, each one becomes a weapon. And when you master your presence, you never have to raise your voice to be remembered. If you've made it this far, it's not by accident. It's because something in this message mirrors the quiet war you've been fighting alone. The years of being overlooked, the conversations where you were never truly heard, the silent strength you've been forced to carry without applause. But this space is different. This isn't just another video. It's a reminder that your silence has weight and your presence can shape more than just your own path. By subscribing, you're not chasing noise. You're anchoring to a code. You're helping build a movement for men like you. Those who are done begging for attention and ready to command respect through stillness, through rebuilding, through real growth. You're not just helping yourself. You're sending out a signal for others still lost in the noise. This is how we rise. Not louder, but deeper. So, if something here felt like truth, to stay. Not to consume more, but to become more. For you, for the brotherhood, for the mission,